we've been communicating forever, but have we actually met before? Oh,
We
please don't
have
make me feel
never met
stupid.
before.
Okay,
No,
good.
I think we connected for the first time probably back in 2018 when the book was first coming out, and I reached out to you. Um, and little did I know really that I was reaching out to April Vokey, and that you're such an important person. I think I was wonderfully blind to who the really important people in the fly fishing industry are. And I'm so grateful for the help that you've given me.
Oh, well, the thanks goes both ways because you reached out to me after I'd had a baby. And
Yes.
so your timing was just impeccable. And in a lot of ways, you've actually spurred me to where I am, to write my own book, which I've done and
Wow.
we'll talk about later. But I want to
I can't
focus,
wait.
we've got lots to talk about, but I really
Yeah.
want to talk about you first as a
Hmm.
person, then as an
Hmm.
angler, then as an author.
Okay.
So where were you born and raised? Where did it all
Um,
start?
I was born in Cleveland, but I wasn't there for very long. And my family moved to the suburbs of New York, a little town called Spring Valley.
Okay.
And I did start fishing when I was about 6 years old. And we would go up to lakes in Maine. And that's actually a story that goes along with the book, which I'll save. And then when I was 10, we moved to California, down to Southern California. Um, and we lived there until I left for college. And it's a town that unfortunately is very, very well known right now. It was Pacific Palisades, which suffered that terrible, terrible fire in January. Um, but I continued to fish there. My dad and I would go lake fishing and we would go deep sea fishing. Um, and he was my fishing buddy, and he's an interesting story himself. And then I came up to Northern California. I went to college at Berkeley for a little while. And then I dropped out of college to go to work in a bookstore. And I've been working in publishing pretty much since then. And that was 1977. So it's been almost 50 years.
Whoa. Okay, we've got to back that right up. So your
Okay.
relationship with your dad, interesting story in an eclectic kind of way. Was what kind of story?
My dad was a business writer, and he was an alcoholic. And when I was a kid in New York, it didn't seem, I never noticed that he was an alcoholic. When we moved to California, almost from the day that we got there, his drinking became a major, major issue. Um, but 3 years later, in 1970, he hit rock bottom. And on August 16th, 1970, he had his last drink. And when he passed away in 2017, he was 47 years sober, nearly 47 years. And that ties into my relationship with Reeling and Serenity, which is the nonprofit whose board I'm on. Um, and when we talk about Reeling and Serenity, I'll tell you that whole story too, because it's important to me. Um, but he was somebody who wrote a novel about his drinking. It was made into a TV movie starring Dick Van Dyke, who is about to turn 100 years old. Um, and every time I see Dick Van Dyke, it feels like he's my dad, because it was an autobiographical novel, autobiographical film, and he played my dad. And I have seen him in person several times and reminded him that he played my dad, and sometimes he remembers and sometimes he doesn't. Um, but again, it was a really influential thing in my life. And my dad's sobriety and his journey, and the influence he had on other people with substance issues, was profound. He actually wrote anonymous recovery books that sold millions of copies. And I hear from people all the time still how impactful those books were on their lives. So I'm tremendously proud of him.
Yeah, when you said he took his last drink, I had this sick feeling that he had passed.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was
Yeah.
sobriety.
Yeah.
So he was your fishing buddy as well?
He was. And, as I said, when I was a kid, we would fish in Southern California, but over the years we did travel and fished in places like New Mexico and Colorado. He moved to North Carolina, eastern North Carolina, and lived on a creek, and we would fish off his dock. And a few years before he died, his wife went out of town, and I came and I sort of hung out with him, just the two guys. And I hooked us up with a guide to fish the Neuse River, which is this vast, vast river. And we did not fly fish that day. We used big chunks of some kind of fish that the guide put on our hooks. And we were fishing for drum, which I guess is redfish. And so we were just sitting in the boat, hanging out, two rods propped up with bait hanging in the river. And suddenly one of the rods went down, and I went to get it. And I pulled the rod out of the holder. Am I allowed to swear?
Yeah, it's open forum.
Okay,
Go for it.
So I picked up that rod, and I felt this fish, and I said, "Holy shit!" And I fought that fish, and it took me around the boat. And it was a trophy drum for that river. It was like 35-inch fish, which is probably the biggest fish I've ever caught. And we were stoked. We were just so thrilled. And then another rod went down, and I went and got it. And I said to my dad, "You're going to bring this one in." And as I said, he was about 85 years old. He probably weighed 120 pounds at that point. And he fought that fish. And again, it started taking us around the boat. So I took the rod and I took it around and brought it back to him. I have these photos of him sideways cranking on this rod. And he brought that fish in. And I have a photo of him holding it with this look on his face of just pure joy and astonishment. And until the day he passed away, every time we talked, we would talk about that day and those fish. It was the greatest. It was amazing.
The book that he wrote, or the movie that Dick Van Dyke was in, which movie was that?
It was called The Morning After. And it came out, I think, in about 1973. I have so many stupid, funny stories, but I worked for a publisher called Random House. And Michael Eisner, excuse me, the head of ABC and Disney, had written a memoir, and he came to our sales conference. He sat at a table with me, and I had to have a conversation with him, which is challenging. And he had talked about his early years in TV and working on the ABC TV movie of the week. And I said, "Do you remember a project called The Morning After?" And he said, "Yeah, that was my project." And I said, "That was my dad's book." And the president of the company was sitting next to me. He said, "That's incredible. The two of you sitting here have this in common. I can't believe this." So that took up about 2 minutes of conversation. I don't know what I said after that, but it was a pretty good coincidence.
I love this. Now, Random House is no joke. That's a huge publishing house.
It's a huge publishing house. And I worked there, and I also worked for Penguin Books, which has now merged with Random House. So I had the good fortune to work for two of the very, very best publishers. And the company I work for now, Abrams, is a really wonderful publisher as well.
Those are all heavy hitters. So why did it take you so long to write a book?
Well, I wrote a story a long time before I had a book. I started writing down by the river 15 years before it got published, and had lots of different versions of it. Here in California, in Northern California in particular, there was an online fly fishing board, and it was a very cranky political group of people and fought all the time. But as I had a manuscript ready that I thought was pretty good, I asked these people on the board if they would take a look at it, and I got all sorts of great feedback. Ended up having a couple of literary agents who were friends and who thought they could sell it, but they couldn't. And I worked for Abrams by then, and decided I would take it to one of the children's book editors. And his response to me was, "I'm not sure I can buy a book by somebody who works for the company." And he said, "But I'll check." And he checked, and he said, "Well, I can, but I don't want to." And so, okay. And I had the good fortune then that there was another editor of children's books whose family fished. And she said, I really like the beginning of what you have here, and I'd like to work with you on this story. Her name was Susan Van Meter. And it took about a year and a half of her working with me a little bit and then going off and working on her other projects and then coming back and giving me ideas and feedback. And one day she said, I think we're ready. I think I can bring this to the editorial board. And shortly after that, she said, we're going to make you an offer. And that was the beginning of the process of finding an illustrator and eventually having the book published, which to this day is the great thrill of my life. The last story I wanted to tell you was about this synchronicity between Susan, my editor, and me, and why it made so much sense that she ended up being the editor of the book. A few years ago, there are these silly holidays. It's National Cousin Day and International Women's Day. To me, every day is that International Women's Day. But I went along with it, and I posted a picture on Instagram from fishing in Maine when I was a little boy, sitting in a boat with my two sisters. And I said, here I am with my sisters fishing at Kezar Lake in North Waterford, Maine. And Susan saw that post, and she commented, and she said, that is insane. That is the lake that my family fishes at. And just that coincidence was unbelievable to me. And somewhere deep in our lives, we were meant to work together on this book. And she actually asked me a couple of years ago to sign a copy of the book for her uncle Bob, who was the person who introduced her to fishing and to the outdoors. And he was the person who had brought her to Kezar Lake for the first time. And he was a month from passing away. She knew that he was going to die very, very soon, but she wanted him to have a copy of the book, just to know that it was out there, to know that it had meant something to her, for him to take her to that kind of life and fishing. So it's one of my favorite things about the book.
Okay, let's talk about the book. Now, the story that you had written initially, was it what we see today, where it's okay, so what was the original story?
It was a little bit different in that it was the same boy, and all around his house, there were photographs of his parents fishing and holding big fish. And he just thought, I really want to fly fish too. And eventually they take him out on the lawn and they teach him how to cast, and then they take him out on his first day fly fishing. And it evolved from there, where it became the grandfather and his mother and himself. And it had gotten to that point before the editor saw it. But there are pieces of it that are still there.
And why the evolution?
It was always my intention for it to be a family fly fishing story. And I just came around to liking the idea of it being sort of a long-time family tradition, where it was a grandfather who had fished with his daughter, and now he was fishing with his daughter and his grandson. And that the place that they went to fish was somewhere where they had fished when she was a young girl. And it was a place that endured as a beautiful place to fly fish.
I always thought maybe that it was that your mom had fished. Why did you choose it to be a mother-son and not a father-son?
I don't think it was really intentional when I wrote it, but I'm so glad that I did write it that way, because women in fly fishing are in some ways the future of this sport, and they bring so much to it in terms of their passion and their grace and their skill and their dedication to the sport and what it holds for the future. And they also, I think, can bring kids into it in a particular way that maybe men can't quite. And there was the good fortune that that was how it was written, because right around the time the book came out, Orvis was really starting up the 50-50 on the water movement. In my experience, since the book has been published, with so many amazing women in this sport. I mean, I can name 100 different women who have been so kind to me, who are such models for how you should be in this sport, whether it's somebody like Cheyenne Orvis or Heather Hodson, to just people who I admire so much. So really glad that
Personally,
I did it.
we were stoked because it was
Yeah.
the perfect book for us. We wanted to get Adelaide into fishing.
Yeah.
Obviously, I fish, and so I wanted it to be something that was really relatable,
Mm-hmm.
and it was perfect. It was a little old for her at the time because I think she was a
Mm-hmm.
year when we got it, but it's great because now at 7 years old, it's perfect. Had you
Yeah.
thought about the age group when you sat down to write it? What was the age group?
The age group is probably 4 to 10, something like that. Because of my career in publishing, I love picture books, and I have sold picture books for years and years. And I thought, with my experience writing, which was very little, that writing a picture book would be the best thing I could do, because basically a picture book is three pages of text that gets spread out across 32 pages or 40 pages of a picture book. And even with that, the challenges of writing a good story, 3 pages long, it's not easy.
No.
But I do love picture books. And of the books that I've kept that the publishers I've worked for have published, so many of them are picture books. And I've met so many great artists and writers, and I have a lot of art from children's books in my home as well.
I would argue that it's one of the hardest things to do. For me, my word count, my age group for my book's a little younger, more like 3 to 7, I'd say. And 580 words was my limit. And every single word has to count, as you know.
Absolutely.
How many words were in your book?
I'm not sure how many, but I do know that my editor kept telling me, we're going to cut this out. We're going to cut this out. The pictures tell the story. We're going to cut this out.
Right? You have
And
to decide which one, where's the picture going to tell the story? Where are the words going to, and for you, yours is not only an experience and a lesson, but there's also entomology in there and
a little
all
bit.
sorts of river information. It's a very knowledgeable, or it's a book
Thank
filled
you.
with knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you. I had an idea of wanting, wanting flies to be on the end papers.
It's one of my favorite parts. I love them.
It's kind of my favorite. I have so many favorite parts of that book. It's hard to say which is my favorite. But we haven't talked about April Chu, the illustrator, yet.
Oh, we're getting there.
Phenomenal.
Don't you worry.
But just the story with April and the flies was, we were probably going to do 12 flies on each of the end papers in the front, and then duplicate them on the back. So there would probably be 24 flies altogether. And I went to my local fly shop and bought what I thought were a couple of dozen really essential flies that I like to use, and gave them to her. And she started drawing them, and she made a little video for Instagram. And she's sitting holding a fly saying, "Flies are so cool." And she just got really engaged with that. And she ended up buying a bunch more flies. And now the book ended up with almost 80 unique flies, no duplications. And I know it's a favorite thing for parents and kids to share, whether it's just naming what the flies are, or even going fly by fly and tying them together, which
Oh,
is
that's
super
a great
cool.
idea. That's an excellent idea. How did you find her? Because that ended up admittedly being the hardest part for me was trying to find an illustrator.
I met her at a party that a children's book writer and illustrator had at her house in Berkeley. And a lot of the people brought their portfolios with them. And I looked at April's art. She had done a couple of books before, and I saw how talented she was. And this was before the book had been accepted for publication. And after the party, I sent her an email with the manuscript. I said, "I'm wondering if you would be interested in illustrating this book." And a day later, she wrote back. She said, "No, I don't think so." Thank you, though.
Oh,
Um,
all right.
but the good part is that after I worked with Susan and she edited the book, I sent it back to April and I said, it's now accepted for publication. It's, I think, a much better story. I'm curious if you'd be interested now. And she wrote back, she said, I would love to illustrate this book. And that's the power of an editor. They make something appealing to an artist and to an audience. And my gratitude to Susan is through the roof. It's just, I owe her so much.
This is amazing. Okay, so I would say that April's art really suits the story.
Yeah.
The whole book is, in my opinion, perfect. The only thing I can think of now as someone who has gone through a similar process is how expensive it is. When I look at your book, I just see cha-ching, 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 everything about it because it's
I've
good
made
quality.
so much money. I'm so rich now.
What does it retail for?
It started out $17.99, but because of the cost of goods these days, the hardcover
was $17.99
US dollars.
But still, that's
but
how do you make any money off that? Sorry.
Oh, you don't. And I'm so glad that I have a real job.
Yeah.
Because if I didn't, I'd be broke.
Right.
And with the tariffs that are now in place, the next printing is coming in, and it's going to be $19.99. So it's gone up, within the context of $17.99 quite a bit. The interesting thing about the process with April was she had a project that she was finishing when we signed her up to do the book. And then she had LASIK surgery on her eyes. So she had another 6-month gap before she could start working. And it took forever. But I knew it was going to happen at some point. And while I waited for her, I gathered material because she didn't know anything about fly fishing. She had never fished. And so I would go through my dozens of fly fishing magazines and go online, and I would, select pictures for her so she could see this is what a stream in autumn looks like. And this is what a brown trout looks like. This is what a rod with a fish looks like. These are what people wearing waders look like. And I gave her this big folder full of stuff, and she used a lot of those images. The funny part was that I went through the story and annotated it with what I thought the illustration should be for each spread, and I gave it to her. And Susan, the editor, wrote me an email. She said, okay, let her be. Let her decide what the illustrations are going to be. And the great thing is that they ended up almost exactly the way that I envisioned them. The one thing that is most different, if you remember the spread where they're looking up and there's an osprey in the air, that was actually how I pictured it from their perspective, looking up at the bird. And she chose it to do it from the perspective of the bird looking down at them. And it gives the opportunity for the shadow of the bird to be on the water. And it's perfect. When we talk about favorite parts of the book, that's definitely one of my favorite spreads. And I think the other one is when the grandfather and Art are walking upstream and they're holding hands. It kills me every time I see it. I just love it.
Why didn't you do a second one?
Well, I've written another fly fishing manuscript, and Abrams changed their policy to what that first editor said, which was that they wouldn't publish books by employees. And I think the reason that happened was that there were other people who wrote at the company and felt that it wasn't fair that one person had had a book published and their manuscripts weren't being looked at. And I got back to that same issue I'd had initially, which was that editors, other places didn't understand the appeal of a fly fishing book. And I think I was struggling to get that story right. And I've written a few other stories. And the one that's getting the most interest right now, I think you will love this, is called Sadie the Bookstore Dog. And Sadie is based on my Vizsla, Sadie. And now that you have a Vizsla pup, I think if it ever gets done and it ever is illustrated, it will definitely have a Vizsla because they're the best.
Are we living parallel lives?
Maybe a little bit.
Your
Yeah.
books are just, please send them over. They are so fitting with our family.
Wow. Okay.
They really
Actually,
are.
I will send you some stories that just are stories, because there's one that I think you and Adelaide would really love. It's about a girl and her grandmother going to Snoqualmie Falls in Washington State and seeing peregrine falcons nesting across the river. Um, I like it. I think it's a nice story. So
Yes, I love
it'd be fun to
this.
share.
Okay, so that's next on your writing list. I think I read
Mhm.
in one of your interviews you say that you don't write enough to get writer's block, and I thought that was such a I thought that was such a great quote to
It's
to, to say that.
it's funny because when I write a story, and the fact is I've had one thing published, so I wouldn't call myself a writer. I usually have an idea, and over the course of just a couple of days, I can flesh out that picture book text that I envision. But clearly, the stuff that I've written after this needs more work to be acceptable for a publisher. So it's just the very, very beginning of the process.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you were just being modest or if you truly.
No.
Oh, okay, because I didn't know if you were actually writing novels in your spare time. Did you have any, or do you have any aspirations to break outside of the children's book market and do something for adults?
I actually have a manuscript that I have on and off been working on for decades and decades and decades, which is about being the son of an alcoholic at the age of 17 and writing about the relationship of that kid's parents um, from the perspective of the kid, a marriage that falls apart, um, a recovered alcoholic who suddenly wants something different in his life, and being a teenager and all of that. And it needs a tremendous amount of work if anything is ever going to come of it. But it was very cathartic to write it. If we had 6 hours, I could tell you stories about my family and my mother and her book selling career and all of that stuff. But she
Wait,
was
your
a
mom,
bookseller.
she was as
She was a
well.
Yeah, she was a bookseller. She's If my dad was my fishing buddy, my mom was my book buddy and the person who brought me to this industry and my career. And she passed away back in 2018. Another person who I owe so much to. I have photographs of her where she's looking at the printed sheets from the book before it was published, and tears in her eyes. And when she finished, she said, "This is the most important book ever written." And it's just
Oh,
so sweet and so funny, because it's certainly not the most important book ever written. But
but it was the first, right? I don't. I remember when I had Adelaide, I was trying to find books very similar to yours, and I couldn't find any.
there are some out there. There's one called Olive the Woolly Bugger.
Yes, I've
Um,
seen all of the Bully Bugger. That's right. Actually, I
and
forgot about that. Right?
David Shannon has a book. I forget what it's called. And David is just a tremendously important children's book writer. I think James Prozac did a children's book as well, but not specifically about fly fishing. And I'm allowed to say this because I didn't do the art, but I think it's by far the most beautiful children's fly fishing book. April did the most wonderful job on the book, so
She did.
it's gorgeous.
Let's talk a little bit about Real in Serenity. Is that what?
Reeling in Serenity.
Yeah. What is Reeling in Serenity?
Reeling in Serenity is one of a number of really wonderful nonprofits that uses fly fishing for healing. And our focus is taking people who are working their sobriety on free fly fishing retreats. And from the response that we've gotten, it absolutely fills a niche. It was something that there was a need for. And the story of my involvement with it, um, as I did outreach for my book, I used Instagram, which is how I met you. I used LinkedIn quite a bit, and I would reach out to people in the fly fishing world, conservation, environmental education. And I met a woman named At the time, her name was Becca Sue Powell. She got
Yes.
divorced and her name went back to Becca Sue Klein.
Hmm.
And she worked for Chattahoochee Riverkeeper in Georgia. And we hooked up on Instagram as well. The book was out by then, and she reached out and asked if I would donate a couple of copies of my book for a fundraising dinner that they were doing. And of course, I actually love to use the book for fundraising. And I sent her 2 copies. And because she was Becca, she sold those two copies for $5,000.
Of course she
I mean,
did.
it's just astonishing.
Oh.
And one of the first magazines to review the book was Done Magazine, Jen Ripple's
Hmm.
magazine. There's a really wonderful review that she wrote, and I subscribed to that magazine. And I had an issue that was just sitting on a chair for months, and I finally picked up the issue. And there was an article about a group of women who had gotten together, and they were all in recovery, and they had spent a day together fly fishing to celebrate their sobriety. And all of the photographs are taken with the women's faces turning away because it's anonymous. And in the middle of the article, there's a photograph of a woman holding a book. You can't see her face. And it's one of the books that my dad wrote, one of the recovery books called A Day at a Time. And it just blew me away. I was close to sobbing looking at it. He had passed away by then. And I posted about it on Instagram and on Facebook. And Becca sent me a message. She said, I just wanted to let you know that was me in that photograph. And it created this bond between us. And from that gathering of women became the organization, which at first was called Reeling in Recovery. And then there's another organization with a similar name who asked us if we would change our name, and we did. And we became Reeling in Serenity and held our first retreats in 2023. But before then, Becca actually asked me if I'd be willing to be the president of the board, because I guess she figured nobody else would take on that responsibility. And I was very, very happy to do so. And to be part of a nonprofit from its beginnings and to build an organization, it's a humbling and incredibly rewarding experience. And to work with Becca and to work with the other founding members and the rest of the board has been so inspiring to me. And as some people may know, and I know that you know, even when I met Becca back in 2021, 2022, she was suffering from metastatic stage 4 breast cancer. And she was fighting it and getting all the possible treatment for it and suffering all of the different tangential illnesses that you can have when you suffer from cancer and you're being treated. And she was actually a participant for Casting in Recovery, the great nonprofit that works with women with breast cancer. And she was a river helper for them. She started the Becca Sue Klein All Kids Fish program through Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. She worked with Heather Hodson and others in the I Fish, I Belong nonprofit. And all this time, she's fighting her cancer and doing her best to live her very, very best life, and fishing and traveling and speaking for all of these organizations. I don't think I've ever met a more inspirational, powerful person. And she passed away in January. We celebrate her every day. And it's a very emotional thing for me. I got to speak at a TU gathering in Idaho Falls last year at their Western Rendezvous. I was part of a panel of people speaking about nonprofits, and you can tell I'm emotional about this. And it's sitting in front of this group of people talking about Becca and the organization, and close to tears. It's not an embarrassing experience because it is so true to what all of us who know Becca experience. And I feel like I owe her so much in my life. And anything I can do for this organization, I will continue to do. And anything I can do for nonprofits in the fly fishing world, to me, that's the great benefit of the book, that I've met so many people who do such tremendous work, and that I can support them through this book, and raise money and speak and be a part of what they do. It means a lot.
I figured you guys were close because I know when she passed, I'd seen, uh, some stuff from your end, and I was starting to put two and two together.
Yeah.
We love reading strong women books, inspiring women books. They're some of our favorite series in this house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wouldn't it be cool to have a kid's book and have her be a character? I can see her.
It's a great idea.
She's such a huge energy. I could just see a really amazing inspirational book.
Maybe you and I should
there.
work on that together.
Pulling Heather. Becca was on the tip of our tongues a lot when we were in Chile this January, because that was the trip that she had wanted to go on. It was one of her bucket list trips. And so Heather went in her place, and we spoke about Becca a lot. So just putting it out there.
Here's the saddest thing of all to me. I never met her. We never met in person. Everything we did, she lived in Georgia. I live here in California. And we had phone calls and we had Zoom meetings, and we worked very, very closely together. And I never met her in person. And it breaks my heart. But there's going to be a tribute to her life in October in Georgia, and I will be there. And I will meet my fellow Reeling and Serenity board members for the first time. And just look forward to that so much.
Get ready for some good stories. I met her when I was pregnant, and she was hosting, or she was putting on a fundraiser, and I came in to speak. And I just remember seeing this babe walk around the corner. She was so hot, and she was just this amazingly welcoming energy. And I thought, yeah, I could get to know her a little better. But
yeah, and the transformation that she went through, it was so sad to see as she weakened, and her voice became quieter and quieter, but that passion never went away. Yeah, she was a super, super special person. And our bond was something that was one of the great bonds I've ever had with anybody in my life.
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily need to meet in person to have that.
Yeah, that's true.
So your role, is that a woman specific, or is that a male and female? Is that an all-inclusive organization?
All inclusive. And we did have, I think, a men's only retreat once, but I think all of the others have been co-ed. This year we have seven retreats scheduled, and they range from Colorado, Montana, Vermont, North Carolina. We've had Georgia. We've had Pennsylvania. We're a 100% volunteer organization. So we work hard to find the locations, find the people to work them, gather the participants. And we just had one last weekend that I've heard was spectacular. And I haven't been to one of them yet. And I hope to be at one, if not this year, next year. But I have participated for the first time as a river helper for Casting for Recovery, which it was so fantastic. It was every bit of the inspirational experience that I expected it to be. It's an amazing organization.
Oh, big time. They've been around forever too. They've been doing a great job. Can I pick your brain a little bit about something that was not on my question? I don't have a list, but my mental question list. Mm-hmm. Alcoholism. When I was doing my TV show and was interviewing a lot of the older generation, I noticed that a common theme with my guests was that they'd come back from the war, they had a problem with alcohol, and they started fishing. And I think there's a lot more alcoholism or alcohol abuse. Yeah, I'm going to go out and just say that. Alcohol abuse and fishing than a lot of us realize. I look at a lot of the best steelhead fishermen I know, a lot of my close friends, and they have got an alcohol problem. I don't know if fishing makes people drink more or if people fish to drink less. Maybe you can help me.
I think it can be both. And I think that one of the challenges with almost any kind of outdoor sport, outdoor recreation, is that it's this opportunity for alcohol companies to brand themselves with an activity. And so often you see an ad and somebody's got their beer or they're drinking their scotch. I think alcoholism, substance abuse disorder of any kind is pervasive in and out of it's everywhere. And I think if you don't have somebody within 1 degree of separation from you who has some sort of substance issue, you're the rare person. I can't say that I know anybody who doesn't have that in their life. And I do think that in fly fishing, it can be such a part of the experience. You're on a guided trip, you're drifting down a river, there's a cooler and it's full of cold beer, and you finish your day fishing, you pop another couple of beers, and it's camaraderie, and it's just that spirit. So I do think that it can be an issue for fly fishing, fly anglers in particular. The people who we serve at Reeling and Serenity generally are not fly anglers. They're people who we want to introduce to the sport, because we recognize that it is such a healing activity, and it is that same model that Project Healing Water and Real Recovery and Casting for Recovery, the Mayfly Project, all these great nonprofits use, where they're bringing in people who don't have that experience with fly fishing and put them into that environment and have them step into a river and feel a fly rod in their hand, and maybe, if they're fortunate, feel a fish on the end of that line. And then they can know that experience can be a healing experience for them going forward in their life. I remember an experience I had when I was working at Penguin Books, and I had applied for a managerial job, and I didn't get the promotion that I wanted. And I was actually in Montana, and I was fishing the Madison, and I was so pissed off. And I just remember casting, the worst casting I ever did. But even just doing that and standing in that river and occupying my mind with my body and catching a few fish, it just calmed me down. It settled me down. I was still pissed, but I was calm. And everything worked out fine after that. But it is such a great healing activity where, as you know, you step into that river and everything else just fades away, and your focus is, this is where I am. This is where the fish are. This is what I need to do to put my fly where they might be. This is the unbelievably beautiful place that I get to experience this. I don't think there's an activity that gives a better opportunity for that kind of focus and pleasure and reward more than fly fishing does. Yeah. But I'm prejudiced.
So what's next for you as far as your career?
Well, I am going to be 68 in 2 months.
You are not.
Yes, I am.
I am so happy this is on YouTube so people can see you.
Well, I do have white in my beard and stuff.
No.
But
sorry, no.
I've been doing this for a long time, and I do have an exit strategy for a couple of years from now. I've been working since I was 19, and even before that, in high school, I worked at the public library in Pacific Palisades, which was one of the buildings that was lost to that horrible fire. And then my goal is to continue with volunteer work, which I love doing, and to fish a hell of a lot more. I have not fished enough the last few years. I'm actually going up to Bend, Oregon in a couple of weeks to go fish the Deschutes, which has become a real favorite of mine. Trying to figure out other trips for this year. Last year, my girlfriend and I went out to the Eastern Sierra and had a beautiful trip near Mammoth. She and I have been a couple for about 6.5 years now. She didn't fly fish before we got involved. And of all the people I've ever dated, she's the one who has fallen in love with fly fishing the most, to the point where we'll be out and it'll be late afternoon and I have something in mind for us to do. And I'll say, sweetie, we probably should get going. And she'll say, can we just another half
One
an
more
hour?
cast.
Can't we? And I always say yes, because how could you say no to that?
Yeah.
And she loves it so much, and the time that we get to spend doing that together. So that's definitely my bucket list as well. But there's so many places I would love to get to. Chile, as we mentioned, Slovenia is on my bucket list, and New Zealand and Australia and Tanzania. I've heard about great fly fishing for trout in Tanzania. I want to go up to the Alberta area. I've met Paula Scherer, and I'd love to go fish with her. And Amber, I forget Amber's last name, and her husband, who live up in Alberta as well. But there's a million places. So that's what I have planned.
Well, I love it. I had no idea that you were going to be 70 soon. So live your best life.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I really hope that you write another children's book.
Thank you. It's my plan.
Okay. And let's stay in touch when it does come out, because I'd love to share it with my audience as well.
I would be so grateful, as I already am. And you and I, we have this bond of Vizslas that will never be broken. I was so happy for you when you posted about your new puppy, because
he's laying next to me.
The joy that you're going to have with that dog, I know you're already having it, but there's no better. I'm sorry to all the other people who have other breeds of dogs, whatever. Vizslas are special. And someday I'll have another Vizsla. That's actually part of my bucket list too, to get another Vizsla.
I love it. Well, let's definitely stay in touch on that. Now, don't hang up, because I want to pick your brain about this.